What we're doing is we're just gathering together at Jesus' feet, and we're listening to him tell these masterful stories called parables. These are stories that make God's kingdom easier for us to understand. So last week we opened the series with the parable of the prodigal son in Luke 15. But what you might not have realized is we didn't actually finish that story. It was a great story already, but we haven't finished it yet. And so today we're going to finish the story of the prodigal son. So first what I want to do is I want to get you caught up with the first part of the story in case you're here this morning and weren't able to join us last week. And so before we read it, I want to remind you that in the parables, there's usually a God figure and an us figure. And in this parable, the father is the God figure and the son is the us figure. Okay, so let's start reading. Once there was this man who had 2 sons. One day the younger son came to his father and said, "Father, eventually I'm going to inherit my share of your estate. Rather than waiting until you die, I want you to give me my share now." And so the father liquidated assets and divided them. A few days passed, and this younger son gathered all his wealth and set off on a journey to a distant land. Once there, he wasted everything he owned on wild living. He was broke. A terrible famine struck that land, and he felt desperately hungry and in need. He got a job with one of the locals who sent him into the fields to feed the pigs. The young man felt so miserably hungry that he wished he could eat the slop the pigs were eating, but nobody gave him anything. So he had this moment of self-reflection. What am I doing here? Back home, my father's hired servants have plenty of food. Why am I here starving to death? I'll get up and return to my father, and I'll say, "Father, I have done wrong against God and against you. I have forfeited any right to be treated like your son, but I'm wondering if you'd treat me as one of your hired servants." So he got up and he returned to his father. The father looked off in the distance and saw the young man returning. He felt compassion for his son and ran out to him and enfolded him in an embrace and kissed him. The son said, "Father, I've done a terrible wrong in God's sight and in your sight too. I have forfeited any right to be treated as your son." But the father didn't listen to any of that. He turned to his servants and said, "Quick, bring the best robe we have and put it on him. Put a new ring on his finger and shoes on his feet. Go get the fattest calf and butcher it. Let's have a feast and celebrate, because my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and has been found." So they had this huge party. Man, that's a great story. I mean, Jesus, you are such a talented storyteller. Wow. But here's the kicker. This story's not even over yet. In fact, you might want to put your big boy and big girl pants on and maybe a pair of Depends on underneath that, because this story is about to take a hard left turn. There's another character in this story that you and I haven't met yet. So let's read on. Now, the man's older son was still out in the fields working. He came home at the end of the day and heard music and dancing. He called one of the servants and asked what was going on. The servant said, "Your brother has returned, and your father has butchered the fattest calf to celebrate his safe return." And the older brother got really angry and refused to come inside. Angry? Why? Oh, I can think of a few reasons. Number one, your brother left you with the workload. Your dad's getting old, and what your brother did was took his part of the inheritance and left you with his part of the work. And the whole time he's been gone, you've been faithful, and you've been there with your dad. Your brother also broke your father's heart. And while he was out there squandering his inheritance, you were watching your father suffer over that. You've watched his heart break. And then there's the money part of it, right? I mean, your brother wasted half of what your father spent his life working hard to acquire to provide for the family. But there's this other possible reason, too, that we don't think about as often. Maybe the brothers were close, like brothers often are. And maybe the older brother felt hurt, and maybe he felt abandoned when his younger brother left. We don't know the exact reason for his anger, but what we do know is that to the older brother, the younger brother has become an outsider. You know, if we're not careful about it, it can be easy to start believing that because we've kept our nose clean, that somehow the ones who haven't are less important than we are. That maybe they deserve less than we do. Well, the older brother is either working through his emotions or he's just pouting, but he will not come inside. And so the father came out and pleaded with him to join the celebration. So listen, let's give a round of applause for this father. I mean, no wonder he's the God figure in this story. He is a really good dad. Not only does he forgive the younger brother who took his half and left, he also doesn't mistreat the older brother for pitching a fit out back instead of joining the welcome home party. What he does is he just tries to get his older son to come inside. But it says that the older brother argued back. Hey, listen, time out. I don't know if you've realized it yet, but there are actually two us figures in this particular story. The first us figure is the prodigal son, who is currently being celebrated inside at the party. But the second us figure is the older brother who's out back arguing with the father. He says, listen, all these years I've worked hard for you. I've never disobeyed one of your orders. But how many times have you even given me a little goat to roast for a party with my friends? Not once. This is not fair. Do you know the difference between selfish and self-centered? Selfish people know they're being selfish. They kind of mean it. But self-centered people don't always understand what they're doing. They just see the world through their own filter. They just see the world through their lens, and they tend to make judgments about things based on how those things affected them personally. And there are many people in the world that don't mean to be selfish. They're just self-centered. This older brother is looking at all of this through the lens of what he's lost and what this has done to him and what he thinks he's entitled to in life. He says, not once, Dad, have you given me a party like this. And then he says the word. The word. I mean, the word that causes so much drama in this life. The older brother drops the F word on his father. He says, this is not fair. Did you know that fair, in the way that we use the word, is not a thing to God? Fair is about what I think I deserve, what's coming to me. Fair is about what I feel I'm entitled to. Fair often ends up being about this superficial kind of equality. But you know, what's important to God is not superficial equality. God's concerned about what's right and what's just and what's merciful in the eyes of His kingdom, not ours. God's concerned about things that are full of grace and redemption. Well, the older brother says, Dad, this is not fair. And he goes on, he says, listen to how he uses his words toward his brother. So this son of yours comes, this wasteful delinquent who has spent your hard-earned wealth on loose women. And what do? You butcher the fattest calf from our herd. Do you hear what he's really saying? He's saying, Dad, he doesn't deserve that kind of attention. I deserve that kind of attention. Why are you so worried about the one who left you? I'm the one who stayed with you. There's this other parable Jesus told about a shepherd who actually left 99 sheep who were safe and secure in their pen to look for one rogue sheep that had wandered away. Now, we would look at that and we would say, hey, buddy, listen, cut your losses. Let that outsider go. But man, that's not the way God does things. God says, no way, I'm going to go find the one. I'm going to find the prodigal. You know what I love in this story, that the father isn't really angry with his older son. He just tries to affect the way his boy is looking at things. He says, my son, you are always with me, and all I have is yours. But your brother was lost, and now he's found. Don't you get it? It's kind of like he was dead, and now he's alive. Can you see this scene going down out back behind the party? Can you hear the God figure talking to the us figure? Hey, that outsider, that prodigal, that's your brother. That's my son. Stop calling him this son of yours. That's your brother we're talking about here. He says, son, there's room for both of you in my heart. Can I ask you a question? Does your heart ache for the prodigals in your life to come home? Mine does. I don't know who the prodigals are in your life, but you know who they are. How have you been feeling about the prodigals in your life lately? How have you been treating them? What kinds of words do you use to describe them when you're talking about them in private out back behind the house? Have you allowed those people to become outsiders to you? I mean, God's sons and daughters are real good about doing that to each other sometimes. So maybe this morning we can hear the Father reminding us, hey, those are your brothers. Those are your sisters. Those are my children. They're lost. I mean, that person in your life that has made things hard, that's my kid, God says. I wonder, have you been praying and fasting and hoping against hope for that person to come home? Or has it been better for you for them to just stay away? I wonder if the older brother ever sat with his dad on the porch to watch and wait, just in case his younger brother came back home. This really is a story about God and us. It's a true parable. And it's not just the prodigal son that represents us in this story. The older brother represents some of us too. We are increasingly self-centered. Much of what we do because of what we feel like we're going to get out of it. Much of the way we treat people has a lot to do with the way they've treated us rather than what's right and loving and grace-filled and just. It happens with our family and our friends and our co-workers, and man, sometimes it even happens in churches. And it creates this problem for those of us who want to follow Jesus, because God's heart burns for those who are far from home. God's heart breaks for the prodigal. And I think sometimes we older brothers need to remember that the cross of Jesus didn't just have your name on it. It had everybody's name on it. So what about you this morning? How much time have you spent really this week praying for the prodigals in your life? Do you find yourself resenting the prodigals in your life? Do you find yourself secretly hoping they're going to get what's coming to them? Or do you just find yourself hoping that they're going to find their way back home? Do you know what it's like to not be able to sleep because someone's far from home tonight? So the father says to the older son, "Son, you're missing out on the whole celebration. It's time to let go of this resentment. Everything I have is yours, and trust me, there's plenty. But your brother was lost, and now he's found, and man, that's a real reason to celebrate." Here's what the dad doesn't do, and this is important. The father doesn't say, "You know, son, you're right. That rascal's cost us so much. Let me go stop this party and put the rest of the fire-roasted, fatted calf in the freezer so you and I can feast on it later in private." No, that's not what he does. The dad just looks at his older son with compassion and says, "Son, I understand what you're feeling. Trust me, I get it. And I want you to know that you are my son, and there's nothing you can do to make me love you less, and everything I have is yours. But he's my son too. And even more importantly than that, he's your brother. And I have enough resources left to take care of all of us. And there's plenty of love in my heart for the both of you." But you can kind of hear the father say, "But son, for tonight, I'm going to have to leave you with a choice. You can stay out here and spend your time thinking about how unfair your life is and how all this isn't equal and fair, and you can miss the celebration. Or you can come inside and welcome your brother home. But I'll tell you what I'm going to do, son. Your brother was lost, and now he's found, and I'm going back in to the party." Hey, let me throw one more thing in there before we're done. So this is 100% imagination on my part. But when I think about this story, I always imagine one extra scene. It's a scene that would have happened early in the story when the prodigal son is still far from home, and the father's on the porch waiting and grieving and watching for his son. And in this extra scene that I'm imagining, one day the older brother realizes how hard this is for the father. And I imagine the older brother stepping out on the porch and sitting down by his father and saying, "Dad, is there anything I can do for you?" And in my mind's eye, I can see a spark flicker in the father's eyes as he turns to his older son and says, "Actually, son, yes. Would you mind going to look for your brother? I can't make that journey, but would you be willing to do that for me?" And that's a pretty reasonable speculation, I think, for this story. And you know why? Because you and I are the body of Christ. Our hands and our feet are supposed to be the ones living out God's heart in this world. And you know what? This morning, I will bet the whole farm on this. If you and I were to step out on the porch today and to sit down by the Father whose heart is breaking and grieving over the prodigals who are far from home, and if we were to lean into God, you and I, and if we were to say, "Hey, Father, is there anything we can do for you?" Do you know what I think he would say? I'll bet you he would turn to us with a glimmer in his eye and say, "Actually, yes. Would you be willing to go and look for my prodigals and see if you can find a way to bring them back home?" Who are the prodigals in your life? And how do you feel about the prodigals in your life this morning? Are you more preoccupied with hope for their safe return? Or are you more preoccupied by resentment because of what they've done to you? Are you more focused on what you've lost? Or are you more concerned with them being found? And then there's this final question that the parable leaves us with. What are you going to do when the prodigal finally comes home? I mean, are you ready for that? Are you preparing yourself in any way for that? Is your heart ready for when the prodigal comes home? I mean, when the prodigal walks back through that door, are you going to go to the party and celebrate, or are you going to just settle for a quiet protest out back? What if the prodigal were to come home today? So as we end this parable, we watch the father turn and go back to the party. And we know that he has left the older brother, and he has left us with a very important decision to make about the prodigals in our lives. I'd like for us to take some time to reflect this morning. And as we reflect, I would invite you where you are to bring the prodigals in your life to the forefront of your mind. Maybe even talk together with your family or whoever you're watching with about the prodigals that you all share in common. Maybe you could spend some time while the worship team is singing, asking God to break your heart for them. Asking God to help you to get over any resentment, any feelings you might have about what they've done to you, so that you could spend your time focusing on hope for their safe return. I would encourage you to take this time to reflect and think about that and ask God to give you a passion for the people that He has such a deep passion for, regardless of what they've done to you. So, Mother Teresa, now she's Saint Teresa of Calcutta, made a statement a long time ago that I have always loved. And as we prepare for the worship team to sing and for us to have some time of reflection about the prodigals in our lives and the state of our hearts toward those prodigals, I want to leave you with this quote from Saint Teresa of Calcutta. She said, "I have finally found the paradox that if you love until it hurts, there can be no more hurt, only more love."